session. Okay, and then I assume everyone can see my screen. Yes. Okay, fantastic. So welcome everyone to the next webinar in our scientific assessments series. For those of you that attended our previous two webinars, welcome back. For those of you that are just joining us today, good to see you. So before we dive into today's presentation, I wanted to do a quick once-over of what SCBNA is, what we do, and then go into introducing our presenters before we dive into the rest of the webinar. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with SCBNA, we are the Society for Conservation Biology of North America. We are affiliated with the Global Scientific Society for Conservation Biology. And our goal, broadly speaking, is to advance the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. And we do this primarily by promoting an environment that welcomes, supports, and empowers anyone and everyone that is engaged in conservation. Now, we in North America do this in three different ways. One, we offer professional development opportunities like today's webinar, but we also do so in the fields of developing specific skills for students and early career researchers. We also offer conservation education workshops. We have chapters that are spread out throughout the region. So there's many ways that we provide these professional development opportunities to our members and to anyone who is engaged in conservation. The Society also manages a number of research and publication journals that are accessible to everyone, but particularly members. And then we also have a biannual conference, the next iteration of which will be taking place next year in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So there's a lot of different ways by which we try to empower the conservation community in North America, today's webinar being one of those ways. Now, if you are not a member of SCBNA yet, I always encourage you to become one. There's a lot of useful resources that we offer. And so this is a QR code that you can use to go into our membership page, but I also mentioned that I will add all of the links to our website, membership page, and so on in the chat just after I finish our introduction. Okay, now one thing I wanted to mention is that everything we do at SCBNA is volunteer-led. We have a number of different committees that help in developing all of our different programs, and one of those committees is our policy committee. Now the committee, again, its goal, broadly speaking, is to bridge the gap between conservation science and policy. And it does this in a variety of different ways. One, by engaging with members and chapters on policy issues that are of interest to those members and chapters. We also write and develop common letters and toolkits for issues that we believe are relevant to our broader society. And we also develop professional development resources like today's webinar. So the committee is really very actively engaged in developing everything that we do. And it is made up of some amazing individuals. Our current chair is Lauren Janitis, who's the executive director of Tropical Audubon. She is also the vice president of policy for SCBNA, but we also have other members who are engaged in this work. Now, I always like to mention that if you want to contribute to some of the programs that we're developing, especially in the policy field, please send an email to the address on the screen or reach out to me directly if you want to join the committee. There's always spots open. We welcome new perspectives and new members all the time, and it'd be great to have you. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping items for today's session. This is just going over some of the functions that you have as a part of our Zoom webinar today. First thing, if you want to have a live transcript or closed captions for today's webinar, I encourage you to turn those on your end. Unfortunately, this recording won't include those. We're unable to properly record those closed captions. So if those are useful to you, please start them now. In addition, if you have any questions either now or during our Q&A session, please feel free to use the chat function. You're also free to unmute yourself and ask questions at the time, but during presentations, the chat function is usually the way to go. In addition to that, feel free to have your video either on or off. There are No specific guidelines on this from SCBNA side, although seeing everyone's faces is always great from a presentation perspective. And lastly, if you have a question or just want to react in the moment to what our presenters are saying, feel free to use the reaction functionality as well. It's always the fun way of reacting live to our presentations. Okay, so again, for those of you that are new to the series, SCBNA and SCBNA's Policy Committee has recently developed a series to cover the importance of scientific assessments. So how do these assessments come together? What is their value to society, the scientific community, and how can they be used by a variety of different stakeholders and decision makers? We've so far had 2 webinars on this subject. One of those covered sort of the introduction to how scientific assessments come together. Last week's webinar talked about the different ways that stakeholders use assessments. And then today's webinar is going to talk about scaling those assessments in different ways, from federal assessments to regional to local assessments, and how that might change the nature of the assessment itself. I will mention that today's webinar will conclude the webinars in our series for the remainder of this year. However, next year in the winter and spring, we'll have a number of webinars that will directly address chapters of the United by Nature report, which is, some of you may or may not know, the spiritual successor to the National Nature Assessment, which was recently canceled this year. So I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for those sessions. They will also include an opportunity to provide feedback to the United by Nature chapter. So it'd be a bit more interactive than our usual policy webinars. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. First off, we have Dr. Dave Reed Miller, who is the Chief Impact Officer for the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. We also have Dr. Patrick Keys, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. And we also have Dr. Christine Kirchhoff, who's the associate professor and associate director of law, policy and engineering, and an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at Penn State University. Thank you to all of our speakers for being here today, for taking the time to prepare for this webinar. And I will pass it on to Dave for our first presentation.
Great, thanks. And good afternoon or good morning to some folks who might be calling in from elsewhere outside the East Coast. But I'm excited to talk today about scaling climate assessments. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of some personal experience, as I was a climate negotiator at the State Department, where I led U.S. engagement in the IPCC, and then subsequent to that, led the National Climate Assessment, starting under Obama and then finishing under Trump 1, and talking about kind of how those things kind of came into being, how the evolution of those 2 products has unfolded over time, and in particular, what that means for local decision making. And we can kind of have a discussion around the utility of climate assessments broadly as decision-making tools. And I'll start with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right, which was stood up by the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP in the late 1980s. And you can see the objective of the IPCC highlighted there, which is to provide governments at all levels with scientific information that they can use to develop climate policies. And the IPCC as a body was really intended to be kind of the scientific and technical input into the international climate policy regime, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think the question is, does it accomplish this objective of serving governments at all levels in particular? Certainly it does at the international and federal level, as folks are leaning on that content to, say, inform the global stocktake and other types of processes within the UN Framework Convention. So if we think about the IPCC as a process and as a suite of products, right, it started in 1990 with the first assessment report. You have your traditional 3 working group reports: the physical science basis, impacts and adaptation, and then mitigation. And it was a pretty, obviously at the time, it was a pretty monumental shift in terms of how government or how global coordination worked in the science space. But there wasn't a ton of local information. It really wasn't until the third assessment report cycle came out in 2001, where you can't quite see it here, but in the Working Group 2 report, we introduced regional chapters. And so this was beginning to get into more place-based impacts and adaptation measures. In the fifth assessment report, that work advanced as it came out in 2013, 2014. And in particular, in Working Group 1, they included this atlas of global and regional climate projections, which was really a new tool and resource for governments, frankly, at all scales, to start playing with some more localized climate information. And ultimately, now we're seeing the IPCC do a special report on climate change in cities, which is due in, I believe, spring of 2027. So you can see over time this sort of responsiveness to the demand for more localized information. And certainly that's manifesting in the IPCC, but I think we could still, take issue or question how applicable some of this information is to truly local decision-making, depending on how you want to characterize local. So if we pivot to, the federal level, we have the National Climate Assessment, which is mandated by law, the Global Change Research Act of 1990, which I always like to highlight, was passed near unanimously in the Senate just a couple of weeks before a presidential election. So you can kind of just get a sense of how the dynamics have changed. But one of the sections within that law mandated this sort of quadrennial national climate assessment. And you can see what the charge is, right? To integrate, evaluate, and interpret the findings of the program. In this case, the program is the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And to analyze the effects of global change, basically the impacts on basically natural and human systems, and to look out over the time scale of 25 to 100 years. So that's really what the mandate is. And importantly, the primary audience is the president and Congress, right? And so it was really to inform federal decision-making, but at the same time, of course, there's utility to folks at different scales. And so if we look at how the NCA has unfolded over time, the first national climate assessment didn't get done until kind of the early 2000s, maybe. The second one was during the Bush years, and then it wasn't really until Kathy Jacobs came in and led the third national climate assessment with kind of an external advisory committee, where we really had a sea change in how this was done at the national level. And it included not just your kind of standard sectoral chapters, but also regional chapters for the first time. And you can see the black lines on the cover sort of denoting what regions were. So you start to see some level of regionality, some responsiveness to local needs. And then the fourth national climate assessment, which is what I led, we included more regions. We had an even greater emphasis on case studies and provided users with downscaled products, the statistical downscaling from LOCUP, but really to help provide some responsiveness to the demand for more localized information to support local decision-making. And then in the fifth national climate assessment led by Alison Crimmins, that was released just in 2023, you saw the release of this new atlas, which not only basically took some of what we started to do in NCA4 and frankly amplified it significantly and provided a lot more resources behind it, including not just maps, but stories and data at the local level, but also included these new sort of like quasi chapters or appendices on focus areas responsive to kind of emergent or pressing issues that folks were dealing with at the local level, whether it be the nexus of climate change and COVID or wildfire risk or so on. And so I just want to kind of end by saying that while these global and national climate assessments are making efforts to try and scale these things down and address the demand for more localized information, particularly when you think about climate impacts and adaptation decision making. It's still difficult to do that in a scientific assessment, because it's both a snapshot in time and not a dynamic tool, but B, because you're trying to capture so much information. But one of the most important and valuable things that these products can do is inspire action at the local level. And we saw this happen in my beloved state here in Maine, where we took the government's technical report on sea level rise, led by the Army Corps, NOAA, and a couple of others, which was basically the basis for the sea level rise projections used in NCA 4. And that informed a state level climate assessment, which complemented and informed our state level climate action plan called Maine Won't Wait. And in that context, all overseen by the Maine Climate Council, they adopted these sea level rise planning targets based on this underlying governmental technical report. And ultimately, the legislature, frankly, I think was one of the first, if not the first in the nation, to legislate and mandate the incorporation of these quote unquote commit to manage scenarios into state agency regulations. And so to me, it's a really good story on how this has sort of unfolded over time. And we can talk later in the Q&A session about what it's looked like over the past couple of years as it's been implemented. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave, for kicking off the presentations. Pat, I will pass it on to you.
Okay, great. Let's see here. I'll try and share. All right, can you see that? All right, cool. Okay, so yeah, this is honestly really exciting to be a part of this webinar, not least because I can also attend and listen and learn. So today, what I thought I would try and talk a little bit about is some of my own kind of reflections on scientific assessment process as a participant in the assessment itself. And I'm going to be talking about two different assessments today, or kind of my experiences associated with two different assessments. So in case you have to leave, this is what I'm going to say. The first thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is the alignment of scale. So scale really matters, thinking about not just temporal and spatial scales, but those are the examples I gave. You can think about political scales, scales of decision making, and it can really have, I think, substantial implications for how you do the assessment and also almost like how you structure the assessment itself, the process. And I've had different kinds of experiences in terms of how iterative that is. And I think ultimately, well, it remains to be seen how useful the assessments become. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk a little bit about how the importance of alignment between author teams and sort of what you can get out of it. And then I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about engaging with the future. A lot of scientific assessments are conducted for the purpose of informing policymaking that will in some way determine future action or future trajectories of society, how we impact the environment, et cetera. And so that's something that I spend a lot of time in my own research on. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about how I've kind of brought that into one of the assessments I supported. And so the two assessments that I've been participating in are something ongoing that's just now finalizing for the Food and Agriculture Organization for the United Nations. This is a report on the relationship between forests and the benefits they provide to agriculture. And the second assessment is the Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment that was supported in part by the USGS. So the first topic is scale. So I'm calling this scale awareness, but it could be scale alignment. It could be many different things. And I know I'm going a little bit off book here. This is supposed to be regional to local, and I put global to regional here. So forgive me. But I just want to mention that in this, at least in this context with the FAO report, The global to regional emphasis, because this is a global international organization where governments come together and work together in this context through the United Nations and the FAO, that it needed to align, the assessment needed to align with global to regional decision making. But it also needed to, this global to regional analysis needed to also inform national and subnational decision making. So even though we were trying to assess, at least in the chapter that I was supporting, um, the kind of regional, maybe say national scale up to the scale of continents, if not across continents, types of phenomena, it still needed to matter for national scale governments. And so this was a little bit tricky, but it has aligned really well with the audience. The audience is explicitly decision makers that are and policymakers that are participating in ongoing negotiations under the auspices of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And there's actually a meeting happening this fall in Rome where this report will be launched and kind of connect directly to those decision makers. So I will say that there's been an ongoing dialogue between FAO itself kind of telling us like this is the kind of thing that we need, the not this is the information we need, but this is the type of information we need. This is what's going to be relevant and salient to the audience. And that's been extraordinarily helpful in really aligning the scale, in this case, in some cases, the political scale of our guidance. This is just a picture. Okay, so for the biodiversity and climate change assessment, I'm a lead author supporting a chapter looking at policy solutions. At least that's the original title of the chapter. And it was kind of local to continental scale. And an advantage of this was that it permitted a lot more specificity. We could engage very specific national groups, cultural groups, and kind of political scientific groups. I will say that it posed some challenges, and this is just kind of an example of what kind of a local scale activity might look like. Very different in terms of almost even the way that you would think about what policy means at this kind of international forum versus policy being implemented on the ground here. And so I will say that the local to continental emphasis still posed some challenges for how we articulated solutions. So I was on this policy solutions chapter. In the sense of something that sounds practical at the local scale, it's challenging to align that with maybe a high level, something that maybe sounds more bland description of a policy at a national scale. But I'm going to dig into that a bit in a few slides. Okay, another topic that I think is important is author diversity. So again, going with this, the FAO assessment, I was the coordinating author for a chapter on the interactions of forests and climate and agriculture. And I was co-lead with another person who was actually leading the regional to local part. And so we worked together, but we also sort of had our own areas that we were trying to organize. And this also aligned somewhat with the processes, the scientific processes we were looking at in terms of how forests interact with the climate and the benefits that they then do or do not kind of provide to agriculture. And so this is Ludmila Ratis. She was leading the local to regional kind of scale. And then I was trying to assemble a team that could represent the geographies, the scientific domains of this regional to global analysis. And so this is just a brief overview of actually most of the contributing authors for my chapter. And these are scientists with whom I've worked quite a lot and some with whom I've almost worked not at all. But the reason that we tried to assemble this team is because we wanted to ensure that the necessary topics were covered, and also sort of our gaps, our knowledge gaps, or even our perception of what's important was sort of addressed. So as an example, in thinking about the role that forests provide in terms of benefits to agriculture, the Amazon is brought up quite a lot. And so in thinking about the author team and whose voices we needed to make sure we included, we made sure that, for example, we included authors with expertise on the Congo Basin as well. So while this is talking about a specific global report, I think you could take this sort of approach for almost any scale, just ensuring that you've got the right voices in the room. And then the biodiversity and climate assessment, which was, again, this local to continental scale or local to national, was fantastic, at least on my author team, was fantastic because the coordinating leads, who you're going to hear from next after me, are one of them. They invited academics, they invited nonprofit kind of researcher folks, they invited civil servants. And so we were able to actually hear from a very wide range of people as we were crafting the assessment. And that, I think it's really reflected in the content. I will say, and this was, I'll probably always say this, it could have benefited from more Indigenous engagement than we had. I think overall, the report did a fantastic job, kind of a phenomenal job of engaging Indigenous communities. Um, and I still think that, though, that there could have been a bit more, not least because there's such diversity of Indigenous communities across North America. And then lastly, I want to just speak briefly about engaging with the future. One of the things that I tried to do for the biodiversity and climate change assessment was or I was offered the chance, you could say, to try and infuse the initial author meeting or one of the author meetings with a little bit more creativity. And so at the meeting in Asilomar in 2024, I ran a creative speculative futures workshop. This is something I do in my own research. And what this did is it was an opportunity for the participants, this is all the lead authors and coordinating lead authors, to exit their kind of normal domain of what they're thinking about for their research and broaden out and think very kind of creatively, expansively, speculatively about what they're doing. What is this process of an assessment? What is it meant to do in the future? What could it do in the future? This is just a slide of one of the workshop activities. And I will say that the goal was just to try and infuse creativity, and it did. I think it ultimately did lead to a lot of conversation about what's possible. It opened up people sort of like, I don't know, their eyes to different ways of thinking about this assessment. I don't know how it actually translated into a change or a shift in how the assessment ultimately wound up. But I will also say that it led to a surprising other outcome, which was kind of an expression of grief at the emotional confrontation with the content. I think as scientists, we've got sort of this walled off perception of like, we do our science, it's clear, it's clean, there's clean lines. But then when you allow yourself to sort of grapple with the implications of what climate change means and so forth, which is what this workshop sort of does, then it led to something else. And I actually think that might be an important component, thinking about what are assessments for, because people are not just brains, they're emotional creatures. Secondly, internally with the chapter, with the biodiversity and climate change assessment chapter, the policy solutions chapter, we as an author team developed some speculative vignettes to help to illustrate, add texture, to interpret the policy solutions that we were articulating. And they're hopefully going to help to tether the content for the readers, and kind of synthesize the content a bit. But they actually also help to serve as a platform for conversation within the authors as we were doing the assessment and talking about these kind of governance transformations and so forth. It served as both a tool and potentially as an output. So I think that this idea of how we engage with the future in the context of scientific assessments might be important. So you already saw this. Yeah, and just thank you so much. That's it. I'm looking forward to chatting with Dave and Christine and everybody here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Pat. I am loving how all of your presentations are just flowing to the next one. So Christine, on to you.
It'd help if I took off mute. So there we go. All right. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I've already really enjoyed Dave and Pat's presentation, and I do hope that mine on the fly will speak to the others as well. So I wanted to talk more about some of the thinking we've been doing around transforming climate assessments, and this has certainly come out in the biodiversity and climate change assessment chapter that Pat mentioned that he's been, a very important contributing author to. Certainly, the portion that he led around, futuring thinking and things like that has just been an amazing contribution. So that is certainly a piece of what we're talking about. I'm not going to delve into that here since we covered it well, but Let me just jump in. So what I've been thinking about is, this is a challenge here. All right. I have 14 million screens, and so figuring out which one, so apologies. So the thing that we want to maybe discuss first is this idea of a traditional assessment model. And when we think about assessments, and so this often involves syntheses of peer review literature, sort of the classic way we do assessments is we're trying to understand the body of literature that exists on a particular topic, and synthesizing that information in a way that is presumed to be useful for policy and decision making. Sometimes it involves generating new knowledge as part of that, so new data sets, new ways of getting information together. But this traditional way of approaching assessment is really built on this idea of the separation of science and expertise from policy. And really, the purpose of that is to enhance and ensure the credibility of assessments. And so the key assumption there is that this independence of the scientific expertise from the political and policy process would ensure this credibility. And what this really leans heavily in is this, idea of this loading dock model, that we do these assessment processes, these synthesis of evidence, then we deliver that science, those many volumes of reports from the national assessments or the IPCC or state assessments, and that we expected them to be picked up from the dock and used in decision making. But the challenge with that traditional model is that credibility alone is not enough if we're really trying to think about the usability of assessments. And there's great research by Cash et al., where he proposes this model of credibility, legitimacy, and salience as being really integral to the use of science in policy and decision making. And so we focused a lot on credibility, the credibility piece. Legitimacy is really about process. How do we do assessment? Who is part of assessment? So Pat mentioned having diverse authorships, diverse types and ways of knowing involved in the assessment process. So when we think about doing assessment, then you can see how, this idea of a traditional mode versus maybe a mode of doing assessment that's perceived to be more legitimate is quite different, a quite different way of doing it. And similarly, salience is where we're trying to think about, what is that information that we're producing? What type of questions are we are we asking or answering, and who's developing those questions, and is what we're coming up with really useful for policy and decision makers? Is it really relevant and actionable in the end? And then I thought that Dave's presentation about sort of stepping to more regional assessments to now the IPCC's focus on cities are good examples of this idea to generate information that's more likely to be relevant for decision makers at different scales. But the reality is when we do these assessments at different scales, we've heard international, we've heard the regional biodiversity and climate change assessment, we've talked about the NCA, we've talked about state assessments in Maine or specific reports in Maine. And so we have these things that happen at local scales. Even the city of New York, so large metropolitan areas sometimes conduct assessments themselves to really, get at that salience, that relevance of information for policy and decision makers in a particular locale. And so we need to, depending on what scale that we're working in, these kind of tensions or balancing these different needs between legitimacy, saliency, and credibility really, it may vary depending on where you are. But I would argue what we've begin to see at these more local scales is that legitimacy and salience really, these kinds of demands really increase. And yet often at these local scales, resources are typically more constrained. And so it's challenging because part of how we achieve more salient, more legitimate processes is by enhancing participation and really engaging more policy decision makers and other stakeholders in the process. But this is time and resource intensive. So what we've learned, we wanted to learn how from prior assessments before we undertook a state climate assessment. So this preceded some work that I was involved in for the state of Connecticut in conducting a statewide assessment there. And we were really particularly interested in understanding how to get to action-oriented assessments. And so we conducted a workshop, brought in folks who'd worked on other state assessments. We interviewed a number of people who had led or participated in state assessments at the time. And so this was back, the work was published in 2019. So there's even more states that are doing this kind of thing now. But what we really learned was that for state level assessments, that local expertise is really essential for legitimacy. So not necessarily bringing in lots of experts from outside the state, but really bringing homegrown experts mattered for the perception of this process as being legitimate, and so then being more likely to be used. The second thing we found is that despite what we know about the importance of engagement and participation and process, most assessments still focus on credibility. A few really prioritize those other aspects. And a lot of this really boiled down to these resource constraints in part, which force these trade-offs between credibility, legitimacy, and salience. As well as sometimes just the philosophical approach of kind of the traditional mode of assessments being really an expert-driven process. Layered on top of this kind of conversation about, how do we get to actionable is this reality of when we say that assessments are about often synthesizing peer review literature, increasingly even about synthesizing gray literature, we're talking about an evidence avalanche. So how do we realistically do this? In the climate side, you're seeing just an explosion of research doubling, every 5 to 6 years, which is roughly the pace of how we try to do the IPCC or the National Climate Assessment on that time frame. And so it's really challenging to be able to get our arms around all the evidence that is out there. We have an example, the Bring Forward et al. That I'm citing down below, is an effort of 126 scholars across the globe who got together to synthesize not quite 1,700 papers for adaptation evidence that fed into the last IPCC. And that was just an enormous amount of work of manual coding that was involved in that. This kind of thing compounds at a local scale, again, where your resources tend to be more constrained, timelines might be tighter, et cetera. And so a question might be, what can we do in ways that might be able to use artificial intelligence to help us with this assessment, but avoiding this idea of expert-driven syntheses that we've been talking about so far. And so there is really this need then to balance expert-driven syntheses with more meaningful co-production, something that we were trying to get to with our BCCA, which I'd argue we didn't quite get there. So here's some strategies that we've come up with navigating these tensions. We could reframe the assessment purpose from delivering knowledge to creating knowledge together. We could think about some of these important aspects and building them in from the beginning. Thinking about the author teams, for example, thinking about, how do we engage in Indigenous knowledge? How do we realistically engage, integrate those and do this from the start, which again, I think the BCCA did, as Pat said, an excellent job in trying to do that from the beginning. And then using AI for capacity, not control, and then making synthesis participatory to the extent we can. We've done a quick, an experiment. Happy to talk more about this, but I don't want to dominate too much more of the conversation here. But we've done this. We're working on the state of California climate assessment. We have a chapter focused on water, and we've been experimenting with manual versus AI-assisted coding. And really, our key is not does AI take over, but where can AI be used, and freeing up the possibility for more human engagement in the ways that we know that we've that can really help. So we've learned that this traditional separation model between experts and decision makers doesn't really work, particularly at local scales. Legitimacy and salience really requires participation. And then one thing that we've really come to know more about is that we really need a lot more work on assessing assessments themselves. I think that is it from me. I'll skip through that and just say thanks and open it up for Q&A and the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thanks again to all of our speakers today for your presentations. So we are now at the Q&A portion of our talk. Feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question of any of our speakers. Otherwise, you can include it in the chat as well.
Hey, I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. It's really great. Really love seeing, talking about assessments and how they can affect, different regions and states and so forth. I have a question. In my local work and doing conservation in the state of California, we've had a really hard time basically establishing credibility and legitimacy of science when going to talk to like commissioners with the public and doing like trying to input protections for species or some kind of water regulations or something like that. We notice that there's such an increase in misinformation that's basically being spread, and that we have a really hard time combating that as scientists and as experts at the local level. Do you have any, I guess, like, how do you see how misinformation is spreading across society, and how's that affecting the assessment and establishing credibility and legitimacy of science?
I'm happy to take a stab at that, and I'll do so by highlighting kind of a very kind of regional example that we've been experiencing firsthand, and that's with respect to the development of floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. And we as an organization have a long history of engaging with a variety of marine users, and in particular commercial wild harvest fishermen. And there was a lot of bad information, misinformation out there with respect to the impacts of offshore wind development on fisheries, and whether it's EMF from the cables or stats around bird deaths and foraging habitat, all sorts of stuff. And a lot of that stuff obviously spread like wildfire, because people were, as we kind of jokingly said, just going to the University of Facebook to get their information. And what we did, and it's tough because, there are some very, frankly, well-resourced and coordinated opposition efforts out there on almost any kind of coordinated effort to take action on climate change or decarbonization or whatever. But, given our history of working with the industry, we had a reputation for being, kind of a, for lack of a better phrase, like an honest broker of the science, and not necessarily coming in with like a pro offshore wind agenda. So we were able to engage pretty constructively with fishing industry interests, and importantly, acknowledge, what the science hasn't told us yet, what questions are outstanding, and be honest about that, and not necessarily gloss over them. But I think also, empowering people with the knowledge on how to engage in decision-making processes is really important. And so, we made sure that fishermen and aquaculture farmers and other marine users were, again, kind of armed with what is the best available science. We created and curated kind of an offshore wind resource hub online that was really directly responsive to some of the questions that we would see being asked or issues being bantied about on Facebook, and then took those into forums that we had already scheduled around kind of broader fisheries management issues, and leaned into our historical relationships with folks in the community, and those folks can then serve as evangelists and take it sort of a step away from us scientists or science translators. And so it goes back to the old mantra of just find a trusted messenger and have them repeated time and again. And it's hard to battle that. I think when the cacophony of bad information is just growing over time, but it's a tried and true method, and I think finding those organizations or those people that have some resonance with, potentially oppositional communities, oftentimes like the quote unquote hook and bullet crowd is a good one. And so Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, those kinds of groups can be really good to engage on these sorts of issues, in my experience.
Can I follow up on that question to Dave? I'm just curious, how long did that process take? So just to like pull in some of what Christine was talking about in the sense of, capacity, it sounds like there's like some good capacity here. But like I'm trying to think of logistically, you talk with these stakeholders, you're like, these are your knowledge needs or your problems, and then you like co-design some portal, and then it takes time for that almost like information to then flow among the people you're trying to reach. I don't know, like, what's the delta T here?
Yeah, months to years, I'd say. And in a sense, the good news is that like the decision making process to site an offshore wind array is similarly a years to almost decade long process, and so it doesn't change things overnight. And you're right. I mean, maybe that is different than some of these other issues that Anderson may be grappling with in California. But yeah, it definitely takes time, and it takes
Sure.
repeated messaging for sure.
Christine, anything to add to those answers?
I feel like they did a great job. I guess it's funny. We just saw a talk here in Climate Conversations here on Penn State's campus, and there's a psychologist who studies climate communication, and she just gave a presentation about kind of managing there's a model out there from Science Communication about fact. I think it's fact, fallacy, myth, fact, something like that, where you try to. I think Dave put it this way, where you try to provide the factual information in a way that directly addresses the fallacy that's out there, so that it makes the fallacy not make as much sense anymore. And then through repetition, I think the other thing, so part of what might help is thinking about the science, theory of science communication around misinformation and disinformation and what you can learn from there. But I think, Dave, your approach about kind of using a trusted, if there's an organization that you can partner with that has that kind of trust in those groups that you're trying to reach, that could be helpful. Sometimes it's more difficult to establish brand new trusted relationships than it is to go through relationships that are already established.
Thank you for all of your answers. Any additional questions?
I want to take Anderson's in the chat window for a second here, because I think it's a good one. And the question is, how can early career scientists or researchers get involved with assessments? Because it can seem like an impenetrable process if you're not, super well connected or a tenured faculty member or something like that. I think two things I would say. One is, the National Climate Assessment in particular is always looking for new people to contribute. And one of the best ways to get involved is to serve as a review editor, because that capacity sort of introduces you to the assessment process without necessarily being like the world's leading expert in X, Y, or Z. The role of a review editor is really to ensure that the author teams have adequately and transparently responded to comments on a given chapter during a public review phase. So that's one good way. Another good way is to serve as a technical contributor. And so it could be, a more minor role where you're not sort of drafting a whole section, but really contributing to, say, a figure or something like that. And There are opportunities if you look. I'm, like I said, most familiar with the IPCC and National Climate Assessment, but on each IPCC working group technical support unit's website, they'll list the authors. You can reach out to them directly and just say, hey, I'd love to provide some support. Is there anything I can do to help your contributions to this chapter? And those types of cold emails can really manifest in something useful.
Yeah, Pat.
Yeah, just to kind of emphasize that last point Dave made, I think that it might seem like it's this like, oh, very fancy, you're writing assessments. It's, very, I'm not sure what. I think a lot of authors that are working on coordinating teams would welcome contributions, would welcome interest, especially if you're interested to actually do some of the kind of the legwork that we're trying to do in terms of writing and et cetera. And so I think reaching out, if there's a way to reach out and just be open to supporting in kind of different ways, that's a really good way to demonstrate that you're interested, is by finding the authors and reaching out to them and saying, is there any way I can support what you're doing? As a coordinating author for one of these chapters for the FAO report, I can say that I would have been very happy to receive interested emails saying, hey, I would love to contribute this section, or it's like a technical section, or review the chapter, etc. That would have been fantastic. I don't think we're publicly listed anywhere right now, but yeah, so I think you might be surprised at how much some people would be willing to welcome support.
Thank you for those answers. Do we have any other questions from our attendees? I did have sort of a follow-up to Anderson's first question, right? There seems to be this issue of both how can we maybe redevelop the way that we craft assessments or create assessments. There's also the communication side of things, right? And both have sort of inherent capacity issues. So I guess my question is this sort of a chicken and the egg situation, right? Which one of those do we prioritize first to make sure that assessments have the desired impact that we want them to have? Do we spend more time developing those communications channels and take away some of the capacity from the assessments, or do we work mostly on the assessments themselves, but that might take away some of the capacity for developing those communications channels? And also thinking about, assessments take a lot of time to be completed. So, if you spend more time developing those communications channels, is that going to increase the amount of time that you need to spend on assessment and so on and so forth? So just curious to hear you thinking about that.
I don't know if it can be an either or necessarily. I think it's a really good question. The last national, I was lead author of the Northeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment that was terminated. And the National Climate Assessment was really well resourced on the back end and I think the push from Kathy Jacobs to the next iteration with Alton to the last, each time was becoming sort of more emphasis on communication from the get-go. So I think that had been a sea change. And I think that's where the assessments with the resources are there. I think what your question raises is you can't ignore that. The reality is you've got to invest as much in that as you are in the assessment itself.
Thank you, Christine, for that answer. Dave, Pat, anything to add?
I think I would just say, I think Christine said it right. I was going to sort of endorse that for sure. I think the one sort of observation I would make is that there's been, I think, such an evolution and proliferation of expertise in this space that is really exciting and encouraging. In that, when you look back to the early 90s when the first National Climate Assessment or the first IPCC report was done, you had disciplinary experts and maybe a couple multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary experts. And now, as we look at like NCA 6, the United by Nature assessment, where the IPCC is, you have not only all these like super interesting, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary folks, but you have a whole suite of kind of a next generation of experts in terms of science translation and communication that we didn't quite have before. We had scientists who were talented communicators, but now you have like just a bounty of really focused and dedicated science communicators that can do it in a variety of channels, and I think that's serving everyone really well. So to me, it's an encouraging development that I think someone strikes at what Christine was saying, and that we can do both at the same time.
Just one brief add there is, I think it really does matter knowing who you're trying to communicate to. And so if you do have a really clean sense of that, because I think some assessments are probably communicating with a pretty specific audience, whether that be a certain policymaking audience, a certain locality, et cetera. And having some sort of baked in, almost like feedback during the assessment, where you can get some sense of, are we hitting the mark in terms of the types of information that and the way that we're communicating it? Is this going to actually lead to some uptake or an effective transmission of the assessment itself? And if not, tell us like that it's not working. And that requires knowing your audience a little bit so that you can effectively get the right kind of feedback. But I think that can help maybe.
That's great. Thank you for those answers as well. Any other questions from our audience members? Well, then I think we might be able to end this webinar a little bit earlier than expected. But I did have one more question for our speakers, and this sort of goes back to the whole reason why SCBNA came up with this webinar series in the first place, right? We were wondering, as part of the policy committee and as part of the society, really, what is the role of scientific societies in helping recruit folks for these assessments, help build capacity, help communicate. So I wanted to get a sense from each of you, what can SCBNA and other societies do to help in some of the efforts that you talked about today, in addition to these webinars?
Maybe I note that I'm not sure that there necessarily was an organized role, and maybe Dave knows more about this, or Pat. I mean, we've all had sort of different experiences, but AGU and AMS now have banded together with the termination of the most recent national climate assessment that was just getting off the ground to support a special issue. I think they're part of the organization that is helping to organize, nominations, because now effectively, without the State Department's kind of climate arm, we don't have a person who's that liaison that used to be in the State Department. So you're seeing that they've taken on a more direct role in trying to uplift some of the climate assessment work. I would suggest that there could be a larger role for professional societies in this, that historically they haven't had as big of a role. And it would seem, I mean, that's not to say like I remember Kathy Jacobs and Allison coming the AGU again, and I think they did this not just at the AGU but maybe elsewhere as well, but having listening sessions as part of the annual conference, and then the results of the assessment were had center stage and like big poster sessions and things like that. This upcoming one similarly will have a role for the last climate assessment related activities. So I think that there could be a larger role for professional societies, and I think part of it is figuring out how to plug in and to raise your voice and where to insert, and maybe others can speak to that.
Yeah, one thing I might add, I mean, obviously, like socializing opportunities for scoping, those are hugely important because it really decides the direction of the chapter. But also the chances for review. And in particular, what might be interesting, or something that I haven't seen a whole lot, is to offer to host kind of town hall like discussion groups around a given chapter to sort of submit a suite of comments from that result from basically like a journal club in a sense type structure. I think that could be the power of professional societies to pull together groups of interested experts is really powerful. And I think that's something that I haven't seen done before that might be just a real advantage. And I can just say that like it's helpful when you having especially when reviews are oftentimes anonymized, seeing the same comment again and again does get on radars and makes authors think really closely about how they're communicating something. So I just think having leveraging that convening power of professional societies is pretty powerful.
Yeah, and to build off of that comment, I think going back to Anderson's question in the chat, this is an opportunity where kind of like the participants or the members of a particular professional society, the society itself can serve as a conduit to provide opportunities to connect, say, an interested scientist at whatever career stage, honestly, to identify and provide a connection to these ongoing activities, in a way that maybe sort of serves a role that other maybe government activities might have served in the past.
That's great. Thank you all so much for those insights. Exciting to think about what SWNA can do moving forward and how we can collaborate with other societies as well. Well, perfect. I just wanted to thank you all again for taking the time to lead today's session and to present. Thank you for also taking the time to answer some of our questions. And to everyone who's in attendance, thank you so much for being here today. I look forward to hosting you at some of our next webinars come 2026. And I wish everyone a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. A lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.